Block 9, the Civil War Homefront. Well, while the boys are off fighting, people are still living their regular lives. And what went on the Civil War Homefront was also a very important part of this era of history. And when you're talking about soldiers fighting in the 1860s, the people left back at home are the women and the children. Southern women, in the course of the war, women on both sides really did sort of the same things. Southern women and northern women took over running farms, and in the north they took over running factories, and in the south they took over running plantations. The elite southern lifestyle took a huge hit, of course, during the war. So the idea of, southern ladyhood took a hit with it. That all those things that made southern civilization and elite southern society unique all were damaged or destroyed by the war, and that included southern views on women. Southern women, like their northern counterparts, became served with distinction as nurses, both volunteer and as official army nurses. The same was true in the north. In B, southern women took over for their menfolk on farms, on factories, and shops. Many women took jobs in factories, manufacturing, material needed for the war effort. One of the things that was unique in the North was number 3, what was known as the Sanitation Commission. And the Sanitation Commission was started by a woman that was already famous in parts of the North. Her name was Elizabeth Blackwell, and she was famous for being the United States' first female doctor, first female MD. She established the Sanitation Commission. And what the Sanitation Commission was a volunteer organization dedicated to improving sanitary conditions in hospitals, supplying military hospitals with volunteer nurses, raising money for medical supplies, comforting and taking care of and working with wounded soldiers. Tens of thousands of women took part in Sanitation Commission activities throughout the war. It was another one of those middle-class phenomena like the reform movements. It was something for women to do to make themselves feel like they were an important part of the war effort. Sanitation Commission offices were open in every city throughout the country, collecting goods, materials, sending them to the front. Tens of thousands of women, usually single women, volunteered to serve as nurses throughout the war. Number 4, thousands of women did serve as Army nurses throughout the war, including Clara Barton, who became known as the Angel of the Battlefield. Clara Barton would go on to found the American Red Cross in 1881 and serve as a nurse and humanitarian in lots of conflicts around the world until the day she died. Women, of course, it's not in the history books, were of course a source of comfort for the men fighting. That the number of letters to wives, sweethearts, mothers was in the millions. It was a bit of home, for the soldiers living out in the field. On both sides, letter C, it was the women and the children that bore the largest brunt of the seemingly endless line of casualties. Casualties in the Civil War would be listed alphabetically in the newspapers in big columns surrounded by, big thick black lines, and people would crowd around the newspaper offices to check them, hoping that they wouldn't see the names of their husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, friends, etc. The other main home front situation was the draft in 1863. In the North, by 1863, with the war going poorly, the flow of volunteers had begun to slow down. And in order to fill the armies back up, in March of 1863, Congress passed the first ever American draft. All men ages 20 to 45 were subject to the draft, but there was kind of 2 exceptions. If you got drafted, you could hire someone to take your place. Anyone that you could pay enough money to that was willing to take your place for you. So if, Bob was drafted and Bob didn't want to go, he could find somebody to replace him, and that person would be drafted instead. You could also buy an exemption for $300. If you got drafted and went to the government and said, here's $300, take that instead, you got out of the draft. And that's obviously unfair to the poor and the middle classes who could not afford that. $300 was more than an entire year's wage for many, many people in the North at this time. From March of 1863 to the end of the war, 46,000 men were drafted and reported. 118,000 either hired substitutes or paid their way out, and 161,000 names that were picked just never bothered showing up at all. Even though the draft was in force, 90% of Civil War soldiers in the North and the South were volunteers. The draft kind of filled things just kind of up to the top, that most people who fought were volunteers. Whether they were willing volunteers or volunteered because all their friends did or because they were the only one in town that didn't and people talked about them bad, there's all different reasons for volunteering, but only about 10% of soldiers were drafted throughout the war. But in any sense, any draft reflects a huge increase in the power of the national government. If the national government claims the right to draft you into the military, they are pretty much saying that the government has a right of life and death over the average citizen. And a draft might be necessary, and a draft might be a good thing for the country at the time or at any time, but it is definitely an increase in the size and the power of the federal government. The Draft Riots. After the Conscription Act of 1863 passed, and that's the draft, the Conscription Act, after the Conscription Act passed, and conscription, that's a fancy word for draft, draft riots erupted in many northern cities, especially, and none more seriously, than a draft riot in New York. Many poor workers in New York, especially the Irish, were angry about two things. First, they were angry that rich people could pay their way out of serving in the military for $300. But they were more angry at the thought that they were going to be fighting to free slaves who would then move north, they said, and compete with them for jobs. And the Irish said, I'm not fighting a war to end slavery because the slaves are going to come up here and take all the jobs away from the Irish. On the 13th of July, a mob formed in New York City made up mostly of Irish. They attacked the office where a draft lottery was taking place. And for 4 days, Manhattan was a riot scene. Public buildings, shops, houses were burned and torched by the rioters. Finally, the army, or a portion of the army, had to be called in from the battlefield to put down the rioters. And I will tell you that the troops that were called in to suppress the riots had no sympathy at all for the rioters. By the time order was restored, 100 people, mostly rioters, had lost their lives. The effects of the riots in places like New York City were pretty serious. It led to a lot of people supporting the war more because they kind of looked at these people trying to avoid it and looked on them negatively. It led to people financially supporting the war, supporting emancipation, and interestingly enough, it was voiced by some as a reason to give blacks the right to vote. Not because, you know, blacks were so wonderful, but they said, well, the Irish have the right to vote, and a person said, what standard could possibly be named to prevent blacks from voting if the Irish are voting? But after these first draft riots in 1863, things kind of calmed down. There was more volunteering, and the Union never really had any trouble filling the ranks of their soldiers. The Confederacy also had a draft towards the end of the war, but the states' rights theory kind of harmed the South in that the South, you know, believed in states' rights. The South seceded because they believed in states' rights. nullification, Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. It was very difficult to enforce national laws in the South because they were beholden to their theory of states' rights. So the South had a tougher time running their draft than the North did. So that wraps up the Civil War. And that also wraps up the flipped classroom for this year. So I just wanted to thank all of you, seriously, thank all of you for participating in this experiment. I'm going to tweak it for next year. It'll be similar but not the same. I thank you for watching, and I thank you for commenting, and I thank you for participating in this little adventure with me. I think it worked. I think if you put into it what you were supposed to put into it, it worked even more. And like I said, I know this was your time at home and in different places, so I really do appreciate all of your support and all of your help and all of your agreeing to kind of be guinea pigs in this little experiment. It's really appreciated. So, signing off for 2012.